But I gotta say, and I'm friendly with the ladies on The View, but they didn't say anything about this week. Nothing. You know, because it's never been their thing to weigh in on the issues.
Did y'all really think we weren't gonna talk about Jimmy Kimmel? I mean, have you watched the show over the last 29 seasons? So you know, no one silences us.
So Whoopi and The View are freaking out, and it's honestly funny. Just last week, Bill Maher mocked The View for being too afraid to bring up Jimmy Kimmel's problem.
I'm friendly with the ladies on The View, but they didn't say anything about this week. Nothing. You know, because it's never been their thing to weigh in on the issues. You know, it's just an upbeat party show. That's why they hired people named Joy and Sunny and Whoopi.
It all started when the cameras rolled on daytime TV and something strange happened: silence. A huge scandal had just hit late night, with Jimmy Kimmel suddenly suspended, and yet one of the loudest tables in television stayed quiet. The women of The View, who are known for jumping into every controversy with both feet, didn't say a single word, not even a hint. And that silence didn't go unnoticed. It looked like they were too afraid to touch the story, like they were guarding their own seats at the table, instead of doing what they always claim to do: speak the truth, no matter what. The irony? They've never been shy before. Over the years, they've thrown themselves into messy debates, viral headlines, and political scandals without a second thought. But suddenly, when it came to someone in their own ABC family, it was like the air got sucked out of the room. That's what made it so shocking. People tuning in expected fireworks, but instead they got a smile and small talk, as if nothing happened, and that's when the critics pounced. It wasn't just awkward, it was damning. By the way, before we continue, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us grow and share more intriguing stories. Now let's continue. Because when a show that's built its brand on being bold suddenly turns into background noise, it raises one big question. Were they protecting Jimmy, or just protecting themselves? Soon after, the silence finally broke. The women of The View came out swinging, acting as if they had always planned to address the scandal. Whoopi Goldberg stood center stage and declared, "Did you really think we weren't going to talk about Jimmy Kimmel?" She pointed to the show's nearly 30 seasons on air, insisting that nobody silences them. It sounded bold on the surface, but the cracks showed fast. Whoopi claimed they had paused out of respect, waiting to see if Kimmel himself would speak first.
Y'all really think we weren't gonna talk about Jimmy Kimmel? I mean, have you watched the show over the last 29 seasons? So you know, no one silences us. And to all my friends in Italy who reached out, you have to know it's okay, we're still here, we're still broadcasting. And when the news broke last week about Jimmy Kimmel's suspension, we took a breath to see if Jimmy was going to say anything about it first. We did the same thing with Stephen Colbert.
She even tried to draw a parallel, saying they'd done the same thing when another late-night host faced a scandal. But here's the problem. That wasn't true. In past controversies, The View didn't wait. They dove in immediately, offering hot takes before the dust even settled. So why the sudden patience now? Viewers weren't buying it. The explanation sounded rehearsed, like spin rather than sincerity. It was as if they wanted to rewrite history in real time, pretending caution had always been their style. The contrast was glaring. A show that built its reputation on loud, instant reactions was now carefully tiptoeing, claiming to be cautious only when it benefited them. What really stood out wasn't just the words, it was the delivery. Whoopi's tone was unusually careful, almost nervous, as if each line had to be nailed perfectly or risk disaster. And that careful act only fueled suspicions that the hosts weren't being bold at all. They were being careful because they knew the truth was messy. When Whoopi actually read her statement, the whole scene felt different from her usual style. Normally, she's relaxed, unscripted, even blunt. But this time, she clung to the teleprompter like her job depended on it. Her voice was steady, but not in a confident way. It was the steadiness of someone afraid to slip.
Our show was on tape on Friday, but we are live here today and we're getting into it now. You cannot like a now, I want to make sure I got this right. To be clear, you cannot like a show and it can go off the air. Someone can say something they shouldn't and get taken off the air, but the government cannot apply pressure to force someone to be silent.
People watching noticed right away. The woman who never worried about saying something controversial was suddenly choosing every word with surgeon-like precision. It was almost funny in its awkwardness. The show that sells itself on raw, unfiltered opinions now looked like it was operating under a strict don't step out of line order. And here's the kicker. Once Jimmy Kimmel's return to ABC was already secure, The View finally decided it was safe to talk. That timing told the whole story. They hadn't been fearless. They had been waiting. This exposed the heart of the problem. The panel acted bold only when the coast was clear. Their commentary wasn't about courage, it was about covering themselves until they knew they wouldn't be punished. That's why the audience's reaction was so sharp. The View had built its reputation on being outspoken, but this episode revealed a show more worried about its own image than the issues it pretends to tackle. And right when the dust seemed ready to settle, the critics doubled down, mocking the entire act, pointing out that the fearless facade had completely crumbled.
The FCC says they're going to go after maybe next The View. They got a new show lined up. It's going to be great. It's called Morning Wood with James Wood.
And the mocking didn't stop there. Critics jumped on The View like sharks circling blood in the water, and the jokes practically wrote themselves. One line that cut deep compared the show to nothing more than a cheerful daytime party staffed with people literally named Joy, Sunny, and Whoopi. The message was clear. When real issues came up, the show acted less like a panel of fearless commentators and more like a safe space for light chatter. The ridicule kept rolling. Jabs about how quickly they jump into scandals when it involved politicians or celebrities they disliked, but suddenly turned quiet when it was one of their own network stars. It made the whole act look hypocritical. To twist the knife further, satirical jokes spread about the network, replacing them with new programming, poking fun at the idea that The View could be sidelined just as fast as Jimmy Kimmel had been. These barbs weren't just comedy, they highlighted a real vulnerability. The View had cemented itself as a daytime institution, but if their whole appeal was being fearless, then carefully tiptoeing around scandals threatened to unravel their image.
You know, Jimmy, look, I don't think what he said was exactly right. I don't. We don't agree on that. He didn't lose his job for it. He said the MAGA crowd was trying to characterize the assassin as anything but one of them, because the 22-year-old kid his family was MAGA. As if a 22-year-old with a trans girlfriend never rebelled against their family.
The irony of it all was brutal. The show that prided itself on bold hot takes was now being laughed at for cowardice. What started as silence had snowballed into a full-blown spectacle. The longer they tried to spin their choices, the more people noticed that their so-called courage was nothing more than calculated self-preservation. While The View was scrambling to defend its image, the spotlight turned back to Jimmy Kimmel himself. His suspension had sparked the storm, and the big question was, what exactly did he say? He had gone on air after a shocking tragedy and tried to pin blame on the MAGA crowd, claiming the young suspect's family leaned that way. The problem? He was wrong. The facts didn't line up, and his attempt to score political points backfired instantly. Here's where things got interesting. Instead of joining the chorus of comedians defending Kimmel, insisting he had said nothing offensive, one voice stood apart.
You know, look at what this guy is doing. I mean, Jimmy has every right to be wrong, but look at this guy. He was doing porn video games with furries. He was on a game called Furry Shades of Gay 3. This kid is in his basement with VR goggles on, getting virtually by a cartoon wombat? And you're gonna put politics into this?
That voice admitted the truth. Kimmel went too far. But at the same time, it made something else clear. This didn't deserve to cost him his entire career. He had crossed a line, yes, but losing his platform wasn't the answer. That rare mix of honesty hit hard. On one side, it refused to excuse Kimmel's mistake, and on the other, it rejected the cancel culture instinct to demand someone's head every time they messed up. And for once, audiences saw someone in the industry cut through the noise with simple logic. Jimmy was wrong, but wrong isn't the same as unforgivable. It was a sharp contrast to the way others twisted themselves into knots defending him, and that clear-eyed take only fueled the backlash against The View's cautious silence. But here's the twist most people didn't see coming. Jimmy Kimmel's suspension wasn't really about morals or outrage, it was about money. The moment he launched into that rant against MAGA, Disney, the parent company of ABC, watched its stock plummet. We're not talking about a small dip either. Within hours, billions of dollars in market value evaporated. Executives panicked, not because of what Jimmy said, but because those words hit them right in the wallet.
This kid doesn't belong in either party. He belongs in a straitjacket. He's an outpatient who should not be out. But you have the right to be wrong, or to have any opinion you want. That's what the First Amendment is all about. I was defending it last week on the show again.
That's why the suspension felt more like a business calculation than a punishment. It was a public performance designed to show the world that ABC was taking action, while behind the scenes they always knew Jimmy would be back. A slap on the wrist disguised as discipline, and the numbers made it obvious. When a single rant wipes out close to $4 billion in value, no network is going to just shrug and move on. Protecting investors comes first. Protecting a host comes second. Jimmy wasn't sidelined because his words crossed a moral line. He was sidelined because his words cost money, and big money at that. It turned what looked like a political controversy into something far more ruthless: corporate damage control. The lesson was clear when stock prices crash, even the biggest late-night stars aren't untouchable. And the silence from The View suddenly made even more sense. They weren't just worried about offending viewers, they were worried about offending the bosses holding the purse strings. And just when it looked like Jimmy's return was secured, another problem surfaced. Some of ABC's biggest broadcast partners wanted nothing to do with him. Nexstar Media Group, the largest local TV broadcaster in the country, publicly announced it was keeping Kimmel off the air. Their reasoning was blunt. His comments were ill-timed and insensitive during a fragile moment in the national conversation. Then came Sinclair, another broadcasting giant that controls many ABC affiliates. They didn't just hesitate, they outright replaced Kimmel's show with local news programming. That was a massive red flag. For years, late-night shows like his were considered untouchable, guaranteed moneymakers that stations wanted to carry. Suddenly, they were treating him like dead weight.
There's no organization. Antifa is a broad designation with no identifiable leader and no observable plan, like the Democrats. So, Jimmy, let me just say, pal, you did a great, funny show for 2 decades. You should be proud of that. If this firing goes for you the way it did for me, you'll get 23 years on a better network.
This wasn't about one network's punishment anymore. It was about a growing shift. Advertisers were becoming cautious, partners were stepping away, and audiences were tuning out. The endless anti-MAGA rants that once felt safe were now seen as risky baggage. For ABC, this spelled real danger. Losing partner networks meant losing revenue, and once money starts walking out the door, confidence in a host collapses fast. What had started as a suspension was now snowballing into something bigger, proof that Jimmy Kimmel's name no longer carried the same security it once did. The world around him was changing, and suddenly even late-night comedy didn't look like a safe bet anymore. The ripple effects didn't stop with the broadcasters. The controversy spilled right into politics, shining a light on the cracks inside the Democratic Party. Once known as a polished machine with sharp messaging and clear leadership, it now looked like a circus without a ringmaster. Instead of guiding the national conversation, party figures seemed to be chasing headlines, relying on stunts and outrage to hold attention. That's what made the Kimmel fiasco so revealing. Here was a late-night host, aligned with their worldview, trying to turn a tragedy into a political weapon. But instead of rallying the audience, it backfired spectacularly, costing his network billions and leaving allies scrambling to spin excuses. The whole mess became a symbol of how desperate and sloppy the so-called strategy had become. The contrast was impossible to miss. Once, the Democrats dominated the cultural stage. Now, they looked like they were stumbling, hoping comedy monologues could do the heavy lifting of politics. And when even TV executives start pulling back from that message because it hurts their bottom line, the weakness is laid bare for everyone to see.
He is letting the so-called comedy show return after a week's suspension. Some broadcasters are refusing to let his show back on air. Nexstar Media Group, which is the largest local TV broadcasting company in the US, announced that its stations will focus on continuing to produce local news and other programming relevant to their respective markets. What good news. Look, the company says, "We made a decision last week to preempt Jimmy Kimmel Live following what ABC referred to as Mr. Kimmel's ill-timed and insensitive comments at a critical time in our national discourse."
Jimmy's stumble didn't just hurt him, it exposed the hollowness of a movement leaning more on theatrics than substance. It showed that audiences weren't as willing to clap along anymore, and even longtime supporters were beginning to question whether this brand of performance politics had finally hit its limit. Disney still tried to patch things up by bringing Jimmy Kimmel back after just 1 week, but the cracks in the system were showing everywhere. Nexstar stood firm, refusing to air his show, and Sinclair doubled down, swapping him out for local news. These weren't fringe outlets, they were some of the biggest players in broadcasting. Their refusal sent a loud message. Late-night comedy wasn't untouchable anymore. The official line from Nexstar was all about protecting respectful, constructive dialogue, but everyone knew what was really at stake. It was about money, advertisers, and the growing fear that Jimmy's baggage could hurt their bottom line. For years, networks assumed that endless anti-MAGA monologues were safe, profitable, and popular. But now, that formula was crumbling. Viewers were tuning out, advertisers were nervous, and even corporations were starting to say, enough. It was almost unthinkable. A host who once dominated the cultural conversation was now being treated like a liability. And the truth was clear, this wasn't just about one man, it was a sign of a bigger cultural shift. The public was running out of patience with the same recycled outrage night after night. By the time Jimmy returned to ABC, it felt less like a comeback and more like damage control. And the fact that some broadcasters refused to follow along proved the tide was turning faster than anyone at the network wanted to admit. To make matters worse, people started digging up Jimmy's old clips, and the backlash only grew. Viewers were reminded of the times he openly celebrated censorship, like when Donald Trump was banned from social media. On air, Jimmy laughed about it, mocking the former president by listing silly apps he could still use: Spotify, Patinder, even Cameo. At the time, it played as comedy. Now, in the shadow of his own suspension, it looked hypocritical. The man who once cheered when others were silenced was now facing the same treatment, and audiences weren't feeling sorry for him. This pattern painted a bigger picture. The same crowd that had defended constant takedowns of political opponents was now stuck trying to explain why their own star shouldn't face the same standard. It exposed how selective the outrage really was. When it was Trump, it was hilarious. When it was Jimmy, suddenly it was unfair. That contradiction became impossible to ignore, and it pushed even more people to question the entire system. Was it really about principles, or was it always just about power? Viewers began realizing that the rules only seemed to apply when convenient, and that realization hurt Jimmy far more than a 1-week suspension ever could. It stripped away the shield of credibility he had been hiding behind for years, leaving nothing but the double standard for everyone to see. In the end, the whole saga turned into something far bigger than one late-night host stumbling over his own words. Jimmy Kimmel's suspension, The View's shaky spin, and the billions of dollars Disney lost in a single day all pointed to the same truth. The old formula of outrage-driven entertainment was breaking down. Disney didn't suspend Jimmy to take a stand, they did it to stop the financial bleeding. The View didn't wait out of principle, they waited until they knew it was safe. And the broadcasters who refused to air Kimmel weren't making a moral stand either, they were protecting their wallets and reading the room. The audience was walking away. Advertisers were nervous, and the culture that had once fueled endless, woke theatrics was starting to collapse under its own weight. The fallout made one thing clear. People were no longer impressed by staged bravado and predictable outrage. They wanted honesty, even if it stung, and they wanted credibility over spin. That's why the blunt takes cut deeper than all the polished excuses. The tide was turning, and everyone involved knew it. For Jimmy, it meant his career wasn't untouchable. For The View, it meant their fearless reputation had cracks. And for Disney, it meant a single mistake could cost billions. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Also, drop your thoughts in the comments. See you on the next one.